Welcome to another episode of Tales from the Bridge. In this episode, Claire North joins Kevin and myself. We have a great conversation. You may or may not know this, but Claire North is the pen name for Catherine Webb, and Catherine has written many books. We're going to have some links in the show notes, so definitely check those out to find out more about Catherine Webb and her work. We did read the first 15 Lives of Harry August in our book club episode recently, and that was written under Claire North, so definitely go back and check that one out if you haven't yet. It's a fantastic book. As usual, if you have listened to the show for a while, or if you're just joining us for the first time, please leave us a review. Let us know what you think of the show. Write to us. Join us on Facebook or Instagram. We would love to hear from you. All right, Kat's waiting for us. Let's make our way over to the bridge.
We're very happy to have Catherine Webb with us today. Catherine is a British author who has been writing professionally for 24 years, which is quite the accomplishment for someone who's only 38 years old. By my count, Catherine has published 25 novels so far, some of which have been nominated for the Carnegie Medal for Writing and shortlisted for the Arthur C. Clarke, Locust, British Science Fiction, and the Philip K. Dick Awards. Her 2015 novel, The First 15 Lives of Harry August, won the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, and her 2017 book, The Sudden Appearance of Hope, won the World Fantasy Award. Catherine often publishes under the pen name Kate Griffin and Claire North, which is how many of our listeners may recognize her work. Thank you so much for being here, Kat, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. It is a beautiful day in September in London.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, so you're joining us from London today, right?
Yeah, my home city.
Oh, very nice. So let's get started a bit talking a bit about you. You write using some pseudonyms. Can you tell us a little bit about those pseudonyms and why you use them?
Sure. So my first 8 novels were published as me, as Catherine Webb, and I was a quite literal child when I started doing it. And the content, though I'm proud of some of those books, the content reflects the fact that I was a young adult while writing, and it reflects the audience it was intended for. But when I was about 19, 20-ish, I started writing more grown-up books. I'd received my first ever council tax bill. The economy was crashing just as I was about to graduate. So the tone of the books shifted to more swearing and violence. And to sort of distinguish past me from more adult me, the first pseudonym was created, Kate Griffin. And it was there as a sort of PG warning, a parental guidance warning on my work. It was also there because back in those days, bricks and mortar bookshops were still incredibly important to the market. Amazon hadn't become the giant that it is now, though it was on the way. And my surname Webb was right at the bottom of the shelves. It was next to vampire porn and Star Trek books. And so my publisher was like, have you considered having a surname in the middle of the alphabet? Have you considered having a surname so that when people go looking to see if Neil Gaiman has written something new and they realize he hasn't, in that moment of disappointment as their eye drifts down, they see you, a shining beacon of urban fantasy hope. So that's how Kate Griffin came about. And then Claire North came about a few years after that when I wrote The First 15 Lives of Harry August. And it came about because my publisher realized there was an opportunity here to try and sell me in that sort of speculative fiction, slightly pretentious, literary, oh, we're not calling it science fiction, even though it is, kind of slightly more mainstream market. But to do so and to achieve kind of more engaged critical attention, if we're being honest, they wanted to pretend that I hadn't written 6 books of wizards and 8 books of young adult. And so Claire North was born as a pseudonym, and it was supposed to be a closed pseudonym. No one was supposed to know it was for me. And so for about 2 weeks, everyone thought I was David Mitchell, which I think my publisher was quite pleased with. I don't know how David Mitchell felt about it. But then the BBC wanted to chat about the book, and my publisher's plan disintegrated immediately, but in a good way.
Interesting. So it started because of just alphabetical listing, and that's a very pragmatic reason to do it, and one that had never ever occurred to me before. It makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I've never been precious about holding on to the name. I'm more precious about eating.
That is a very practical approach. So your latest book, The Last Song of Penelope, is part of the Songs of Penelope trilogy, which lives in the world of Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. That's a really interesting take. Can you, for the readers who have not read those, can you tell us a little bit about your most latest series?
Yeah. The Songs of Penelope essentially ask the question of what is Penelope, wife of Odysseus, doing while he's at war, or alternatively shagging nymphs, because that is what he spends 7 years doing. What is she doing for the 20 years in which he is respectively fighting and shagging, not at home? How does she run the kingdom? How does she protect her people? And what do you do on an island where most of the menfolk are dead? The men have been drafted to this war. They've never come back. The place has to be run by widows, by mothers, by unmarried women. And how do you protect your island and protect your people in a society where it's simply not allowed for women to rule? So there's a big market out there of kind of Greek retellings. My publisher often says it's more of a Greek reimagining, in as much as it's looking at all the stuff that Homer doesn't talk about, all the bits where the women are not discussed, and yet they still somehow have to survive in a violent and dangerous and very politically charged world, and going, how survive the pirate attacks? How survive the scourge of greedy princes nearby? So it's quite a thrillery sort of series, I guess, in a way. It mucks around with a number of different elements. Mostly, I hope it's fun.
Okay, so because Penelope really has to kind of rule Ithaca, right? When the king is away, and
Yeah.
and that becomes this particular challenge for a queen at that stage, right?
Yes, she has to rule in a society where there are no powerful female figures. If you are a powerful female figure, you are either destined to be murdered, like Clytemnestra, the wife of Agamemnon, who does rule when her husband is away and is punished for it. She is destroyed by society for daring to be a woman with power. Or you're supposed to rule as a woman by not ruling as a woman. You're supposed to marry a man. I think the queens of Lemnos are a good example of this in the Legend of Jason, who are just like, a man's turned up, I must immediately have his babies and marry him. You're supposed to rule through a man, or just, hitch yourself to the nearest bloke who comes along. To try and rule in your own right is almost impossible for women. And Penelope doesn't rule in her own right. She rules in the name of Odysseus. But Odysseus could be anywhere. He is presumed dead for most of his travels. So how do you rule in the name of someone who may or may not be dead and may or may not come back?
And then there's the politics of suitors who want, to gain power through that, right?
Yeah, exactly that. I was I think it's fair to say, quite inspired by Elizabeth I of England, who sort of had this problem. When she came to the throne of England, there were whole pamphlets written about how absolutely barbaric it was that a woman should try to rule. And it was assumed that she would marry a man in order to secure her reign and mean that someone level-headed and not led by their wombs would be in charge. But she had the problem, who do you marry? If you marry the King of Spain, France is going to declare war with you. You're not big enough as England to be a political threat, but in alliance with someone else, you're a political threat. So if you marry Spain, it's war with France. If you marry France, it's war with Spain. If you marry the Duke of Orange, it's war with everyone. If you marry a Protestant Danish king, the Catholic Church will probably excommunicate you and regard you as unsalvageable. If you marry a domestic lord, it's the same problem. If you marry the Earl of Leicester, it's war with the Duke of Norfolk. You actually can't marry anyone without there then being a war that you have to fight and win. But equally, if you say no to anyone, they've got no reason to not just attack you. They're all hanging on in there because you're going, oh, thanks so much for your letter, Philip II. I really appreciate you. You're my number one guy, but you're never actually committing. You're never saying yes. You're never saying no. And the longer you can string that game out, the safer your kingdom becomes, and the more chance you have of securing your own reign.
Sounds like business too. Never say no. Always kind of yes, maybe in the future. Okay. Interesting. And you write in the world of Greek mythology, at least for this past series. What's kind of the motivation there? Why Greek mythology?
To be honest, I wasn't hugely interested in the Greek mythology aspect per se. I was interested in an island of women. What does that look like? How does that work? How does that survive in a male world? And the setting seemed deliciously geopolitical and exciting and full of room for poison and stabbing and spies and murder, which is very much my bag. I was also quite interested in the history aspect from a kind of very tedious archaeological perspective. I like that a bit like in the same way that Game of Thrones is riffing on the Plantagenets and the wars of Matilda and Stephen and all of that jazz, you have this pre-constructed world that is already incredibly complicated and full of people whose motivations you can more or less understand within the cultural language of the time, out to stab each other. So in that sense, kind of the strength of the historical basis gives you a world, but the weakness of it allows you to imagine, if that makes sense. The things we don't know about that time period gives you room to play around with it. So I was interested in the opportunity that presented for crafty fun. And the fact that I then had to learn about the ancient Greek myths and the Mycenaeans was a bonus.
In reading your latest blog post on your website, you were traveling. Were you traveling to Greece? Were you traveling to get more of a feel for what you wanted to write? And does travel influence your writing?
Yes and no. So I wrote most of this during the pandemic when we were all stuck at home with the doors locked. So I did not travel to Greece. In many ways, it was a holiday escape in my head rather than in reality. I do a lot of books that are set in places I haven't been. And people are sometimes very kind and generous and say that seems to work despite myself. People who live there, as always, turn around and say, I see you did this place I lived in. You got the vibe, but this, and this, and this were wrong. It's always the case. If you know something about anything, then the second you encounter, you're like, yeah, you got that wrong. But I aim to capture not necessarily kind of, it's Paris, it's the Eiffel Tower, it's the River Seine, it's Notre Dame. I aim to capture, when doing descriptions of places I've not been, how much is a crepe? Like, is the croque monsieur any good? Do the drains smell when they flood? What is the human experience of being in a place, rather than almost what are the tourist or guidebook headlines? And I aim to do that with Greece. I spent a lot of time learning what would the food have been like, what were the clothes like? What's the non-romantic way of looking at this? Do you have bed bugs? Are the walls going to dissolve in the rain? So I try to always research the human aspects rather than the dramatic tour guide stuff. I am inspired by the travel I do, in as much as I think it is incredibly important for writers to get out and see people and go places. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I will put the exact locations I've been into a book, but there is, again, a vibe you can get just by sitting on a bench on a street in a city you've never been and watching the world go by and observing the humans and observing the patterns of friendship and where people linger and where they don't, and are they ordering greasy chicken wings, and just a different pace or a different movement or even a different quality of sound that I think can inform the way you write the world.
I think that requires a certain level of social knowledge and empathy to put yourself into other people's shoes, and it's neat that you can do that for such a variety of different locations and worlds, etc. In particular, you've written 25 novels, right? And in a career somewhere around 24 years, that's more than a book a year. And right, I mean that must be the case. So you're quite prolific. I think your brain must be uniquely wired to be such a focused writer. I don't know. Tell us a bit about how you can be so prolific.
That's very kind, thank you. I think on the empathy thing, there is a cliche amongst autistic people, which is what I am, that a lot of the time you look at human behaviors and you go, that's very odd. Why are you doing that? And as a result, a lot of autistic people end up studying psychology, studying counseling, studying human behavior, because it is so fascinating. And you're not looking at it in the kind of, I'm feeling your emotion. You're looking at going, you're having an emotion, and it's incredibly important I understand. And it's incredibly important in a way that I solve this human behavior. What is the cause and the effect that has manifested this? And so, though I hope I am an empathetic person who is loving and supportive and generous to my friends, I'm also aware that a lot of the time my observations are of the observation of someone going, why are you wearing those very uncomfortable shoes? And what has brought you out in this heavier rain? And what is the story of that? And so it's almost a trying to solve the world around. And again, you can do that in a compassionate way. I always try to see the beauty in all humans. But I think there is a quite autistic cliche quirk to that observation. As for being prolific, I am lucky, I think. particularly a lot of the prolific stuff comes because I started very young. And I think to start that young, you have to have a certain degree of privilege. I was very safe. I was very loved and supported by my parents. I had the safety and the opportunity to write. And I had the privilege of a good agent and a publisher who has been loyal and has stuck with me. A lot of the time, the question is always asked, why are we not hearing more from minority groups? Why are we not hearing from, people from gender minorities? And I think the honest answer is a lot of the time you don't hear those voices because those voices are already marginalized. They are already having to struggle to make ends meet, to feed themselves, to get by in a world that is geared against them. And it is incredibly hard to be creative when you are unsafe. It's incredibly hard to sit down and write a novel, particularly given that money is often bad, when you are already struggling. So I think I have had the privilege of safety, and I've had the privilege of a consistent publisher who has allowed me to be safe and allowed me to experiment, which has allowed me to keep on writing quite rapidly because I never feel stuck in a corner.
That's a very profound thing to say and recognize. And I think it's also very true for many of us. But there's also a lot of intrinsic things there, I think, that also make you must be, because we've spoken to other authors who probably have a similar situation and they have a very difficult time getting so much done. But to go back to what you said before around empathy, is it almost like, I remember hearing the story of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a bodybuilder. And back in his heyday, he was a very large, very capable bodybuilder, but his calves were small. So he would work on his calves all the time because he knew that he had this underdeveloped ability to grow calf muscles. And I feel like this autism and recognizing that there might be a gap in, your aptitude to be able to see other people's emotions, does that make you overcompensate for it? Does that maybe make you actually better at it than a lot of people who would take it for granted?
I think the first thing to say is that I only speak for one autistic person, not all autistic people. Though it is a cliche that autistic people will often watch and observe, I can only speak for me. There's a wonderful podcast I recommend to everyone called 1800 Seconds on Autism, whose presenters always end with the same motto of, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah. That said, I think it might be slightly stronger in women. There is a gendered aspect of it. There is a tendency to try and find tools to survive. The world is a very loud, very busy place full of people having emotions. And fundamentally, you need to learn how to navigate that to a certain extent. And so it's not even an abstract thing of, I must understand this. It is quite an urgent thing of, if I do not understand this, I may not be employed tomorrow. So in that sense, yes, we are all doing our squats and our calf raises just to get through the next 24 hours. And it is hard and it does have a cost. The reason I say there's a gendered aspect to it is because the history of autism is that women tend to be underdiagnosed, partially because women are expected to mask more. Women are often told that they're not autistic. They've just got a funny personality. They're quirky, or they're hysterical, or they're highly strung, rather than they're experiencing this thing, because the pressure on a woman to conform is very, very high, whereas traditionally men have been allowed to be more autistic in their behaviors, more cliche autism, and the definition of autism is often built on a male presenting behavior. That is changing a lot, and a lot of that is owing to members of the autistic community standing up and speaking out and attempting to redefine the conversation about what this means.
Yeah, and I could certainly imagine that, and it's interesting to hear your firsthand perspective from that, and as it applies to your writing as well. Okay, what about literary awards? I'm interested to hear this because you've been shortlisted, you've been nominated, you've won. What are your thoughts on this? Has it been a help, a hindrance in your life? I don't know if you go to the Hugo Awards or if Worldcon. What's that look like for you?
I will answer this in several parts.
Okay.
It is always amazing being nominated for something because your ego floats around the house for the solid 48 hours. I imagine it could float around longer, but again, I don't have particularly normal emotional ranges. So a solid 48 hours of feeling quite nice. And it's a huge honor and it's very flattering. That said, I've been a judge on a couple of awards. And when you get to the end process, you realize that so much is subjective. So much of it is down to the personalities in the room. And a lot of the time, what you're settling on is not necessarily the most exciting book. It's the book that people can more or less agree on within the criteria that have been set down, that may not necessarily even be the criteria the judges themselves would have chosen to favour. So you suddenly realise that given there can only be one winner and a handful of shortlists, you are discarding so many books that are brilliant and probably deserved that award, but you're discarding it because it's a negotiation. You're discarding it because there can only be one winner. And so actually there is no naivety in my soul about the idea that winning something means you're the best. It means that you're one of the ones that didn't get discarded, but that could just be luck. That means that the other books that got discarded were almost certainly as good, but there was no room. So the arbitrary nature of it leaves little room for self-applauding in my head. And in terms of impact, there are a couple of awards that can have a huge impact. In the UK, the Arthur C. Clarke Award does have an impact. The Hugos have an impact. But to be honest, in terms of raw, brute sales, the impact is not as great as a BookTok viral video, if that makes sense.
Right.
Which is a very complicated emotional reality to sit with. It is difficult as someone who did this before any social media existed to recognize that very simple reality, to recognize the power of these new forms, these new social medias. Again, in the UK, also book box subscriptions will have a greater impact on your sales than most awards. And so again, I think you have to kind of take your ego out of it and be incredibly grateful, but also understand that making it in this industry in a kind of I am safe forever way, and I mean forever rather than I'm going to be all right for the next couple of years, is a privilege given to 0.1%.
So it's ongoing effort, and the awards are just one tool, but that social media aspect sounds like a challenging one. How do you negotiate that? What do you do with social media? What's your take on that?
I literally joined Instagram 3 days ago and I'm trying to work out how it works. I've been on Twitter for a very long time, but the fact that the ad revenue for Twitter is directly funding a man who promotes racist theories and gives succor to hate means that I can no longer really tolerate being an active participation in that ecosystem, which is heartbreaking because my experience of it, my interactions of it have been humane and kind and with lovely and generous people. And I slightly mourn that because of the fascism, I need to step away from that bit. And that's not saying that Instagram's better, but it's slightly better. They will probably censor some of the racist calls to violence before they get too far. My interaction, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I use it particularly well in a commercial sense. I don't think I have the gift of the gab for that. But the way I use it is the way that works for me, which is that it is an opportunity to engage with and say thank you to people who are kind enough to engage with me. And that actually feels very important and humanizing.
Yeah, we have spoken to some authors that, yeah, they feel a little bit of the pressure to be posting all the time, to give updates on how many words they wrote. I've just got into Instagram recently as well. You can find your communities here as well. And I'm sure you've kind of found that where you find your tribe.
Yeah, that I think is the good part of it. All social media as a tool of empowerment and connection could be wonderful and good. I think there is a lot of pressure on authors to have a social media presence to do that. And I think it reflects a very simple truth, which is that most publishing companies do not have the money and the resources to successfully market every single one of their authors. Most publishing houses have the money to maybe promote 5 big books a year, if you're lucky, which means that hundreds of books are just left to hopefully sink or swim on their own terms. And I think the pressure is on the author to a certain extent from the publisher, but also from the author themselves who wants to succeed, to use every tool they possibly can to do that. And those who can do it, I really admire and respect, but I think a lot of authors then end up beating themselves up if it doesn't succeed, even though the odds of it succeeding are very much beyond their control. In an industry where you have very little power over your fate, the feeling that you have failed, in italics, failed to capitalize, failed to make the most of this, I think is especially crushing. And so in that sense, I think for writers, social media can be a double-edged sword. It can be a brilliant gift that allows you to communicate with the community, to engage with other writers, to engage with readers, but it can also be a source of shame, yet another source of I thought I'd be at the top of the ladder, and actually I'm still at the bottom of the ladder, and I've tried everything, and I've posted, and I've planned, and I've worked so hard, and the book just hasn't broken through. Is that my fault? And the answer is no, it's not your fault. Hundreds of thousands of books are published every year. I think something like 170,000 are published in the UK alone. It's not your fault that it's hard. And I think the aspect of beating yourself up and feeling you need to market yourself should never be taken as a thing that you should fail at.
Yeah, definitely. Let's jump over to just one book in particular here. And this is the book that we did read for August, The First 15 Lives of Harry August. We heard about this book from a Hollywood director named Wes Ball.
Lovely.
So
Bless him.
how did that happen? How was it a director from Hollywood that recommended this book to us? And by the way, he said this is his favorite book. I don't know if you knew that.
Oh, that's so nice of him. Oh, thank you, Wes Ball. So Wes was attached to direct for a while, but there still is plans for an adaptation. So the book got optioned many, many years ago, and it passed through many hands. And the furthest ever got in that process was in the hands of Wes Ball, who was working on a script, whole production plans. But then, as is always the case with Hollywood and with films, that contract lapsed. It has now gone elsewhere, which is very sad because he was a great advocate and a very good director. But hopefully it's in the hands now of people who are going to do as good a job, if not a better one. So yeah, it is just the great big roundabout of Hollywood and film. You don't really have a huge say over what happens to any of it.
When we spoke about it, he was talking about how it's a very difficult book to adapt to film. Of course, it would be. It's very complex, right? We've got multiple storyline, or we've got many lives. Let's say it like that. So how do you tell that story? Do you go in order? Do you jump around? Do you think about that when you think about movie adaptation of your story, your characters, your world that you created? Do you think, well, you know what, if I was to put this on screen, I think I would have shifted this around? Or do you say, nope, I'm not a filmmaker. If you want to make this into a film, that's, you guys figure it out?
Honestly, I don't necessarily think about that for the reason that they are very different mediums. The Penelope trilogy actually started out as TV. I wrote some episodes of TV and sent it off to my agent. But her response, well, the response of the industry at large, was, we're not interested in sandals right now. So I turned it into a book. And the process of turning it into a book revealed very rapidly that the demands of a book, and specifically the pacing of a book, requires a very different way of thinking about your plot and your structure from TV. TV eats up plot like a packet of Pringles. It's just going nom, 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 nom. Even if the plot doesn't advance much emotionally, it still is going nom, 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 nom on the plot. Whereas a book, you can't actually do that because you will lose the rhythm, you will lose the attachment, you'll lose kind of the emotional quality. So the difference of medium, I think, requires a different way of storytelling. That said, there is at least one author I know who can do both film and book very convincingly and indeed simultaneously, which is Mike Carey, who did Girl with All the Gifts. And he wrote the book almost simultaneously with writing the film adaptation. But he's also worked in graphic novels a lot. He's won awards for his graphic novels. And so I think he has a stronger sense of how to balance the demands of each medium and make kind of the big plot beats and the big emotional beats land regardless of how the pacing and the kind of structure is going.
Yeah, and just on that topic of adaptations, am I correct in saying Ralph Fiennes has directed or starred in where he's Odysseus and he's returning and it's based on his return? Do you know about this?
I am aware of this film. I'm aware of it because a friend of mine is a classicist and I got a text message in all caps going, yeah. And what the caps mean emotionally, couldn't tell you. I think they mean exactly what they say. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about this. Just don't know. Is it going to be great? I don't know. Say what you will for Troy, it was a pretty poor film, but Sean Bean survived and was quite a good Odysseus. So do I have emotional attachment to that? I don't know. Is this going to be a disaster? I don't know.
But still, it's interesting for you because you've created a very large story in this world, right? You've given a lot more thought and detail, perhaps.
It's interesting because I do love the Odyssey. For all that Odysseus is, part of my language, a bit of a shit, he's still one of my favourite classical characters, and I think he's a lot of people's favorite classical characters. The cultural impact that story has on Western literature cannot be overestimated. It was one of the first myths where you can say, this is a story that centers not the idea of the hero as I must be king, I must be power, but centers the idea of the hero as I just want to get home to my wife, and completely redefines, in a way, kind of masculine motivation in that process, and redefines what it is to be heroic from being brute force, to being just straight up clever. And it's, in that sense, it's an incredibly powerful story. And to a nerd like me, the idea of heroic cleverness, but dedicated to love, is incredibly powerful. And so you don't want anyone to mess it up. But that said, it is so old a story that no one owns it. And there's 1,000 ways of doing it. So I don't feel particularly emotionally attached to the idea of how they do the Odyssey. I think anything will be quite interesting. It is the same thing you have with Shakespeare plays. Hamlet has been performed millions of times. It's just every tumty 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 tum. I knew him, Yorick, tumty tum. It's been done to death. But every time it's done, it reflects not necessarily Shakespeare, but who we are now, how we produce it now. Is Hamlet being depicted as an emo teenager? Is he being depicted as a romantic hero? Is he being depicted as a bit of a git? Is he being depicted as someone struggling with mental health? These choices reflect our culture now. And in that sense, there's no point being precious about someone doing an adaptation, because the adaptation reflects who we are and who they are in a unique way that will not be seen again.
Adaptation and writing in worlds that are familiar to readers. I mean, these are ways to build credibility, and we have familiarity with it, so we're more apt to want to listen and read. And certainly, I can appreciate that and associate with that, and also with being a big nerd. We're big fans of nerds here, because we all are them as well. So, sorry, question here. Moving back to the first 15 lives of Harry August, for the readers who don't know, this is an award-winning novel. It was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Can you tell us a bit about that book? What you think you should share with readers?
I will admit I have not listened to the book club episode because I fear the judgment. But it is the story of a man called Harry August, who was born in 1918, lives his entire life. Some stuff happens, other stuff is quite calm, chilled out, he dies, and then he's born again, but he's born again as himself, exactly where he started, back in 1918. But he retains all the memories of everything he's experienced thus far. And so on every life and every death, he's just recycled back to his beginning point. And after the initial shock of trauma and pain of how could this be happening, he kind of settles into his groove, and tries to work out, what is the meaning and what is the value of this existence? What am I going to do with this eternal loop? Given I know what's coming for the world, to a certain extent for me, like, am I going to run away and have adventures every time? Am I going to try and settle down? What does love mean when you know that someone you love is going to die, but you'll come back anyway? Like, trying to live a life while trapped in this endless cycle, and trying to work out how much he's willing to risk to change it, and if he's willing to hurt people to change it. And I think much more would be spoilers.
Mm-hmm. Right. Wonderful. Just to not do any spoilers, but to say that your take on that approach of redo is not at all like Groundhog Day, and you explore it in novel ways, and it's very cathartic, actually, to have some ideas about, I could redo my life and I could make it different. It's actually a really neat take on time travel, and the idea of being able to send information back in time. Kind of, anyway, I really thought that it was a unique take on a trope that has been written in all sorts of different ways. So this is a highly recommend to readers who like time travel books. That's my feeling on it.
All four of us loved it, so there's nothing to worry about.
Yay!
Where did the inspiration come from for that one?
So my answer is going to be a bit lame, but I'll just tell it to you as it is. Obviously, every writer in the world is influenced by the culture around them, because otherwise you're not absorbing culture. I am not aware of what culture consciously or unconsciously influenced me. What I can tell you is that when I had the idea I was working in Stratford-upon-Avon for the Royal Shakespeare Company. I was there as a lighting intern. And it was hell on earth. Stratford-upon-Avon is a very small town, Shakespeare's birthplace, but once you've seen the birthplace and the swans, you've kind of seen all of Stratford-upon-Avon. And we were doing a kind of theatre called repertory theatre, where in the afternoon you do Winter's Tale, and the evening you do King Lear, and then you do Winter's Tale, and then you do King Lear, and then you do Winter's Tale, and you do King Lear, and you're just constantly cycling these shows round and round and round forever until you die. Not until you die, but that's how it felt. And so I just felt like I was stuck in this loop. And I was straight out of college. I was like 23, 24 years old. No, younger than that even. Not that old. And everyone was significantly older than me and telling me that I didn't know anything and to just stand by the ladder. And it was quite a difficult time. And I remember I was standing on Stratford-upon-Avon High Street, having bought a sandwich, and I was feeling quite low. And I phoned my dad. And my dad had recently left his job and in his old age retirement was doing starting a degree in physics and astronomy. And I was like, Dad, I need you to tell me something, anything that's not about lights. And he went, well, I'm going to tell you about dark matter. I don't think dark matter is real. I think it's a bodge. But actually, the more I learn about it, the more I think maybe it is real. Maybe actually the evidence for dark matter is quite strong. And he went on this massive sprawling spiel about dark matter, and it was just the thing I needed. And at the end of that, he hung up and I went to a cafe and I started writing Harry August. Quite what the emotional journey was from dark matter and a sandwich to Harry August, I cannot tell you, but that's the exact moment, that instant moment outside the Sainsbury's on Stratford High Street was where it happened.
I've been there before. I can kind of picture you eating a sandwich on High Street there. Actually, we saw Romeo and Juliet at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. So that would have been just before.
I was working on that. I was working on Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, it was really? The third one in that cycle.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that would have been...
may have crossed. Oh, amazing.
But let's talk about this lighting here. Are you doing lighting for live shows now still? Is this something you're doing, or?
Yes, I light music gigs. So I'm a lighting engineer and designer for rock and roll, basically.
Oh, wow. So do you get to mingle with the rock stars sometimes, or is this kind of just before and after setup takedown?
I very rarely mingle. My career has had me cross paths with all sorts of unexpected rock stars and actors and A-listers and stuff. But generally speaking, they have no interest in my existence whatsoever. I am just there to make them look pretty, and they don't even bother to remember my name to a certain extent, which is kind of fine. I'm not hugely interested in them giving me feedback about my lighting. So polite apathy kind of works in this career.
So you must feel really good when all the young kids come out. They're like, that was lit.
Sorry, you know when you've nailed it. You know when you've got it right. When 900 people are losing their mind and you were part of that, it is a great feeling. But also, you know when you've got it wrong as well, and you're just a bit like, I missed that. But when you nail it, it's a fantastic vibe.
So you're doing the lighting for hundreds of bands, and you're writing beautiful literature. Like, how does that balance? Is this the balance that you need to be able to do both things, or one of them?
Yeah, it's the balance I chose. I could just write books, but I think, as mentioned, I think it's very important for writers to get out of the house sometimes. I think that as a writer, it is very hard to measure your self-worth as a writer. You can't necessarily measure it by reading your reviews, because for every 5-star review going, this was great, there's a 1-star review going, well, the packaging was damaged when it arrived and I don't like the font. And you feel those, even though you know it's nonsense, you feel the 1-star reviews. And so you can't really peg your self-worth to that. You can't necessarily peg your self-worth to money, because even if you're doing quite well, 15 Shades of Grey is doing better. And as established, you could win every award out there, but a viral TikTok will still be more successful. So you can't do it reviews, you can't do it by money, you can't really do it by such a thing as art, because what does that even mean? It's entirely subjective. And so in the absence of a meaningful way of judging your own self-worth, I think it's quite easy for writers to go mad and to spend their time poring over the keyboards going, but I must make perfection and my words and my edit and the process. but there's no such thing as perfection. There is no ideal book. You can't guarantee a bestseller. Your publisher doesn't know what's going to be the next bestseller. It is a lot of luck. And given that, I personally find it quite helpful to go out and do a job where I observe day in, day out, people going on stage who are having the same emotional experience. You see a lot of artists get up on stage and this must be perfection, and my art, my music, my acting, my performance. And a lot of the time, not a lot of the time, but some of the time, it can make them assholes. Like some of the time you see people behave incredibly badly because of that mechanic, because it's so important. And as a technician, if you see that arsehole behavior, you know it's just another day. You know it's just another shift. Like as one friend of mine often remarks, babe, it is a show, not a cure for cancer. And I find it very useful for me to have that perspective. And I find it very helpful to also have something that gets me away from the keyboard and allows me to think while not being tethered and chained to a screen. And it exercises a part of my brain that otherwise wouldn't get exercised. And as mentioned, I love lights and I love being paid to like music. So for me, it works as a nice counterbalance to otherwise what I think could be a bit of a mania. Also, publishers don't like to publish more than one book a year. You need to slow down a bit.
You have to slow yourself down with a side job. That's great. Can you tell us about what you're working on now? Or what can you tell us about what you're doing now?
So having done 3 books about the ancient Greeks, I wrote a space opera. Because, why not? And I sent it to my editor with my usual cover letter, which read, Anna, I've done a novel and it's your problem now. And bless her, she read it and sighed and went, well, it's not awful enough to reject it. Curses. So there will be a space opera out next year. It currently doesn't have a title. All the correspondents just refer to it as Pew Pew. And it nearly went to final contract as Pew Pew. I've just got edits on that, so I'm doing the edits for that over the next couple of weeks. And then the thing I'm working on after that is probably still fairly secretive, but it is a bit timey-wimey. Timey-wimey. Much more timey-wimey than Harry August was. Much more zippy-zoomy, timey-wimey, all over the place. Time travel has one of 2 roles. It is either the inevitable crushing of an unescapable destiny, or it's Doctor Who having fun. And I am skewing the latter way.
Very nice. Oh, I'm so excited. And presumably
me too.
this is under Claire North. Is that right?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. And what's the timeline for our space opera book?
It is out next year.
Next year, okay.
I feel like maybe autumn next year was cited. But these things are always a little bit subject to fluctuation.
Oh, that's exciting. And when you do your books, do you do audiobooks in parallel with the release, or how does that work typically for you with your publisher?
If there is an audio version happening, my publisher has the rights to the audio version, so they can choose to make it or not make it. They tend to make it, which is great, and I'm very grateful for that. In the case of any audiobook which is narrated by a male voice, they tend to hire a wonderful voice actor called Peter Kenny, who I have met and think is phenomenally good. And he has the gift of making everything I've ever written sound better. But because I think Peter Kenny is great, I also now try to put in tongue twisters on purpose as a kind of, hi, Peter. Tongue twisters or exciting accent combinations. The Finnish man with a Japanese accent walked into the room and said, red lorry, yellow lorry. And every time he just breezes through it like it's not even there. But one day I'll catch him.
Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you very, very much. Join us on Facebook. Join us on Instagram. Send us an email. Write us a review. Let us know what you think of the show. Really appreciate that. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, Kat. That was fantastic. We got to do that again. She is awesome. Until next time.